The rope burn on Caroline's wrist had been there so long she'd forgotten what her skin looked like without it, though the mark was invisible to anyone but herself. A ghost of the future shackle her father promised would bind her to Samuel Garrett come spring. She stood at the general store counter in Red Cloud, Nebraska, on a bitter February morning in 1878, counting out coins for flour and sugar while trying not to think about the fact that in 6 weeks she would become Mrs. Garrett, a title that made her stomach turn sour. Samuel was 43 to her 19 years, a wealthy rancher whose first 2 wives had died under circumstances the town whispered about but never quite spoke aloud. The first had fallen down the stairs. The second had been kicked by a horse. Both tragedies, everyone said. Both convenient, Caroline thought. Her father, Thomas Ellis, had arranged the marriage without consulting her, his gambling debts having mounted so high that Samuel's offer to clear them in exchange for Caroline's hand had seemed like divine providence rather than the devil's bargain it truly was. She had protested, pleaded, even threatened to run away. But her father had locked her in her room for 3 days until hunger and thirst had broken her well enough to nod her head in agreement. The bell above the store's entrance chimed, letting in a gust of wind that scattered the light snow on the floorboards. Caroline glanced up and saw him for the first time, though she wouldn't know until much later that this moment would cleave her life into before and after. He was tall, perhaps 6 feet, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and eyes the color of creek water when the sun hit it just right. He wore a worn leather duster over working clothes, and his boots carried the mud of hard travel. He couldn't have been more than 24 or 25, and there was something in the way he carried himself that suggested he was a man who had seen trouble but hadn't let it make him hard. "Help you?" the storekeeper asked. "Need supplies for about a week on the trail," the stranger said. His voice was deep and warm, with a slight drawl that suggested Texas origins. "Heading up to work the Callaway Ranch. Name's Cole Nash." Caroline felt something shift in her chest, a flutter she had no right to feel. She was spoken for, promised, practically married already even if the ceremony hadn't happened. She gathered her purchases and turned to leave, but her sleeve caught on a nail protruding from the counter, tearing the fabric and sending her stumbling forward. Strong hands caught her before she could fall, steadying her with a gentleness that was somehow more startling than the near fall itself. She looked up into Cole's face and saw concern there, real and unguarded. "You all right, miss?" he asked. "I'm fine," she managed, though her heart was hammering so hard she was certain he could hear it. "Thank you." She pulled away, perhaps more quickly than was polite, and hurried toward the door, but his voice followed her. "Your sleeve's torn pretty bad. That nail ought to be hammered down before it hurts someone worse." She didn't answer, couldn't answer, just pushed through the door and out into the cold morning, but she could feel his gaze on her back, warm as summer sun. The next time she saw him was at Sunday service 3 days later. Samuel had insisted on sitting with her and her father, his hand possessive on the small of her back as he guided her into the pew. His fingers pressed too hard, leaving marks she knew she'd find later when she undressed. Everything about Samuel was too hard, too much, too controlling. He smiled at the congregation like a benevolent patriarch, but his eyes when they fell on Caroline were cold and assessing, like she was livestock he'd purchased and was evaluating for quality. Cole sat 3 rows back, his hat in his hands, his attention focused on the sermon. She found herself glancing back at him throughout the service, unable to help herself. Once, their eyes met, and he gave her a small, uncertain smile. She quickly turned back around, feeling Samuel's hand tighten on her back. After the service, Samuel made a show of introducing her around as his intended, though most everyone in Red Cloud already knew. The women offered tight congratulations that didn't reach their eyes. The men clapped Samuel on the back and made jokes about marriage that made Caroline's skin crawl. She was standing by her father's wagon, waiting for him to finish his conversation with the banker when Cole approached. He walked with purpose but not aggression, his hat still in his hands. "Excuse me, miss," he said. "I don't mean to be forward, but I wanted to ask if you're all right. You seemed distressed the other day at the store." "I'm perfectly fine," she said, though her voice came out smaller than she intended. "Are you?" His eyes searched hers, and she had the uncomfortable feeling that he could see right through her practiced smile to the terror beneath. "That's my intended you're speaking to," Samuel's voice cut in, sharp and proprietary. He appeared at Caroline's side, his bulk blocking her partly from Cole's view. "And I'd thank you to keep your distance." Cole's jaw tightened, but his voice remained level. "I meant no disrespect. Just making sure the lady was well. The lady is my concern, not yours." Samuel's hand found Caroline's arm, fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. "I suggest you remember that." For a moment, the two men stared at each other, and Caroline felt the tension crackling between them like lightning before a storm. Then Cole nodded once, slowly, and put his hat back on. "Madam," he said to Caroline, touching the brim. Then he walked away, but not before she saw the look in his eyes. It wasn't fear or submission. It was calculation. That night, lying in her narrow bed, Caroline stared at the ceiling and tried not to think about Cole's warm hands catching her, his eyes full of genuine concern. She tried not to compare them to Samuel's cold possessiveness. She tried not to imagine what it might be like to be promised to someone kind instead of someone frightening. She failed on all counts. The next week brought early thaw, the snow melting into mud that sucked at wagon wheels and made the streets of Red Cloud nearly impassable. Caroline's father sent her into town for medicine, his gout acting up again, a condition worsened by the whiskey he continued to drink despite doctors' orders. She was picking her way carefully along the wooden boardwalk when she heard shouting from the alley beside the feed store. Against her better judgment, she moved closer and peered around the corner. Samuel had a young man pressed against the wall, a boy really, no more than 16 or 17. His fist was drawn back and the boy's face was already bloodied. "You'll pay what you owe or I'll take it out of your hide," Samuel was saying. "My pa's crop failed, Mr. Garrett. We don't have the money right now, but we're good for it, I swear. Your word means nothing to me, boy." Samuel's fist flew forward, but it never connected. Cole appeared from nowhere, catching Samuel's arm mid-swing and twisting it behind his back with practiced efficiency. Samuel roared in anger and pain. "I'd suggest you let the boy go," Cole said, his voice calm but carrying an edge of steel. "This is none of your concern, Drifter," Samuel spat. "I'm making it my concern." Cole released Samuel but positioned himself between the rancher and the boy. "Go on home," he said to the young man who didn't need to be told twice. Samuel straightened his coat, his face purple with rage. "You've made an enemy today, Nash. Wouldn't be the first time." Samuel's eyes swept the alley and landed on Caroline, who hadn't realized she'd moved into view. His expression darkened further. How long have you been standing there?" "I just arrived," she lied quickly. "I heard shouting." "Get yourself home," Samuel ordered. "This isn't a place for ladies." But Cole's eyes were on her, and in them she saw understanding. He knew she'd witnessed the whole thing. He knew what kind of man Samuel was, and somehow that knowledge passing between them felt more intimate than any touch. She hurried away, her heart pounding, the medicine forgotten entirely. When she returned home empty-handed, her father boxed her ears, but she barely felt it. Her mind was full of Cole's steady strength, the way he'd stepped between Samuel and that boy without hesitation. The wedding preparations continued relentlessly. Caroline's mother had died when she was 12, so the women of the town took it upon themselves to help with her trousseau, sewing sheets and tablecloths and nightgowns that Caroline folded mechanically, feeling like she was preparing for her own funeral. Samuel came to dinner twice a week, and each time Caroline found new reasons to fear him. The way he spoke over her when she tried to contribute to conversation. The way his eyes followed her when she moved around the room. The way he'd cornered her in the hallway once and kissed her, his mouth hard and demanding, his hands roaming where they shouldn't, pulling back only when her father's footsteps sounded on the stairs. "After we're married, you'll learn to be more responsive," he'd said, his breath hot against her ear. "I don't like cold women in my bed." She'd scrubbed her mouth until it bled after he left, but she could still feel the violation of his kiss. 3 weeks before the wedding, she saw Cole again at the mercantile. He was examining saddles, running his hands over the leather with an expert's touch. She told herself to leave, to not engage, to protect them both from Samuel's jealous wrath. But her feet carried her forward as if of their own volition. "That one's poorly made," she heard herself say, nodding at the saddle he was considering. "The stitching's uneven. It'll split under hard use." He looked at her, surprise and pleasure warring in his expression. "You know leather work?" "My grandfather was a saddle maker. He taught me before he passed." It was the first genuine conversation she'd had in months, and the words tumbled out eagerly. "That one in the corner is better quality, costs more, but it'll last you 10 years easy." He smiled, really smiled, and it transformed his whole face. "I appreciate the advice, Miss Ellis, Caroline Ellis, Miss Ellis." He said her name like it was something precious. "I heard you're getting married soon. Congratulations." The word felt like a stone in her chest. "Thank you," she managed, the lie bitter on her tongue. Something in her expression must have shown because his smile faded. "Can I ask you something, Miss Ellis, and will you give me an honest answer?" She should have said no. She should have walked away. Instead, she nodded. "Do you want to marry him?" The question hung in the air between them, dangerous and electric. She looked around quickly, making sure they were alone in this corner of the store. "What I want doesn't matter," she said quietly. "My father's debts must be paid, and Mr. Garrett was generous enough to—" "That's not what I asked." Cole stepped closer, his voice low and urgent. "Do you want to marry him?" The honest answer rose to her lips before she could stop it. "I'm afraid of him." The words, once spoken, couldn't be taken back. They hung between them, 3 syllables that contained all her terror and desperation. Cole's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Then don't marry him." "I have no choice. My father, there's always a choice. You don't understand." "He'll be ruined. We'll lose everything." "And what will you lose if you marry Garrett?" Cole's eyes bore into hers. "What will he take from you that can't be measured in money or property?" She couldn't answer because they both knew. "Everything. He would take everything." "I should go," she whispered, tears burning in her eyes. "Wait." Cole reached out but stopped short of touching her, his hand hovering in the air between them. "If you ever need help for any reason, I'm at the Callaway Ranch, just north of town, about 5 miles on the main road. Will you remember that? Why would you help me? You don't even know me." His eyes held hers, and in them she saw something that made her breath catch. "Maybe I want to." She fled then, leaving her shopping undone, her mind spinning. His words echoed in her head all the way home. "Maybe I want to." Such simple words, but they carried the weight of possibility, of a future she'd thought was closed to her. That night, she dreamed of creek water eyes and strong hands catching her fall. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of final preparations. Her wedding dress was completed, a beautiful confection of white silk and lace that felt like a burial shroud when she tried it on. Samuel's gifts began arriving: expensive jewelry, bolts of fine fabric, a new saddle for her horse. Each gift felt like another chain. She thought about Cole's words constantly. There's always a choice. But what choice did she really have? Run away with no money, no skills beyond housekeeping, nowhere to go. Samuel would find her, and her father would be destroyed. Stay and marry a man she feared, spending the rest of her life walking on eggshells, hoping she didn't end up like his first two wives. Neither option seemed survivable. 1 week before the wedding, Samuel took her for a ride to show her the house that would be her new home. It was grand. 3 stories of white painted wood with a wraparound porch and views of the rolling prairie. It should have been beautiful. Instead, it felt like a prison. He led her through rooms stuffed with heavy furniture and dark drapes, pointing out improvements he'd made, talking about the parties they would host. His hand never left her back, pressing, guiding, controlling. When they reached the bedroom, he closed the door behind them. "I wanted to show you where you'll sleep," he said, but his eyes held a predatory gleam that made her blood run cold. "We should go back downstairs," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "It wouldn't be proper. We're to be married in a week. I think we're past worrying about proper." He moved toward her and she backed away until she hit the wall. "Please, Samuel, not until we're married." "Just a kiss," he said, but his hands were already on her waist, sliding up toward her ribs. "You need to learn to be more accommodating, Caroline. I'm not a patient man." His mouth crashed onto hers, brutal and demanding. She tried to push him away, but he was so much larger, so much stronger. His hands groped at her, pulling at her clothes. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think, could only feel terror rising in her throat. She bit down hard on his lip. He jerked back with a curse, touching his bleeding mouth. For a moment she saw murder in his eyes, and she truly thought he might kill her right there. Then he smiled, slow and cruel. "You've got spirit. That's good. Breaking you will be more satisfying." He grabbed her arm hard enough to make her gasp. "But let me make something very clear. Once we're married, you belong to me, every part of you, and I take what's mine." He released her and walked out, leaving her shaking against the wall. The ride back to town was silent and terrible. Samuel's rage rolled off him in waves, though he maintained a pleasant expression whenever they passed someone on the road. When he deposited her at her father's house, he leaned close and whispered, "Tell anyone about today, and I'll make sure your father's debts land him in prison." "Do you understand?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. That night she sat at her window and stared out at the stars. In 7 days she would be Mrs. Garrett. In 7 days her life as she knew it would end. She thought about his hands on her, his threats, the cold certainty that she would not survive this marriage intact. Cole's words came back to her. There's always a choice. Maybe there was. Maybe it was time to choose herself. She waited until her father was asleep, snoring off his evening whiskey, then carefully packed a small bag with her warmest clothes, what little money she'd saved from household accounts, and her mother's wedding ring. She left a note that simply said, "I'm sorry, I can't marry him." Then she slipped out into the March night and began walking north toward the Callaway ranch. The road was dark and rutted, the moon barely a sliver in the sky. She walked for what felt like hours, her bag growing heavier with each step. The prairie stretched out around her, vast and indifferent, and she began to wonder if she'd made a terrible mistake. What if Cole wasn't there? What if he'd just been making conversation and hadn't meant his offer of help? What if Samuel found her before she reached safety? She was so lost in these thoughts that she didn't hear the horses until they were almost upon her. She spun around to see 3 riders approaching, and her heart sank as she recognized Samuel's broad silhouette leading them. Caroline. His voice was deceptively calm. "Your father's very worried about you." "I'm not going back," she said, proud when her voice didn't shake. "Yes, you are." He dismounted, his boots hitting the ground with heavy thuds. "We're getting married in a week, and you're going to be there in that pretty white dress, smiling like a good wife should." "I won't marry you." I don't want. His hand struck her across the face, the blow hard enough to knock her to the ground. "What you want doesn't matter. Your father sold you to me, and I'm collecting what I paid for." He reached down to grab her, and she scrambled backward, her hand closing on a rock. She swung it at him with all her strength, connecting with his temple. He stumbled, cursing, blood running down the side of his face. "You little," he lunged for her, but suddenly another horse was there, riding hard from the direction of the Calloway ranch. Cole. He leaped from his horse before it had fully stopped, placing himself between Caroline and Samuel. "That's far enough, Garrett. This is none of your business, Nash. She's my intended, and I'm taking her home. I don't think she wants to go with you. I don't care what she wants." Samuel wiped the blood from his face. "She's mine. She's not a piece of property." Cole's hand hovered near his gun. "And she's not going anywhere she doesn't want to go." Samuel laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You planning to shoot me, cowboy, over a woman you barely know, if I have to?" The two men who'd ridden with Samuel shifted nervously. They were ranch hands, not gunfighters, and the prospect of real violence clearly made them uncomfortable. "Caroline," Cole said, not taking his eyes off Samuel, "do you want to go with him?" "No," she said, her voice stronger now. "I never want to see him again." "You heard her." Samuel's face twisted with rage. "You think you can just take what's mine? I'll ruin you. I'll ruin her father. I'll make sure neither of you has a future in this territory." "Her father ruined himself with gambling and drink," Cole said coldly. "And as for me, I've got nothing you can take. But you've got a reputation. How would it look if word got around that you have to force women to marry you? That you beat them when they say no? No one would believe her." "They might believe me, and the 3 witnesses you brought along." The ranch hands exchanged glances. One of them cleared his throat. "Boss, maybe we should just let her go. Plenty of other women in Nebraska." "Shut up," Samuel snarled. But some of the certainty had left his posture. He looked at Caroline with pure hatred. "This isn't over." "Yes," Cole said quietly, "it is." For a long moment, Samuel just stood there, breathing hard, blood still trickling down his face. Then he remounted his horse with jerky, angry movements. "Your father will pay for this," he said to Caroline. "I'll see him in debtor's prison before the month is out." He wheeled his horse around and rode back toward town, his men following. Caroline stood there shaking, unable to quite believe what had just happened. Then her knees buckled and Cole caught her, just like he had in the general store, his arms strong and steady. "I've got you," he said softly. "You're safe now." She burst into tears, all the fear and tension of the past months pouring out of her. He held her through it, not saying anything, just being solid and present and safe. When the sobs finally subsided, she pulled back, mortified. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have. Don't apologize," he said firmly. "You've got nothing to be sorry for." "What do I do now?" The question came out small and lost. "I can't go home. Samuel will come for me there." "You'll stay at the Calloway ranch. Mrs. Calloway's a good woman. She'll put you up until we figure something out." "I can't impose." "I have no money, no way to pay. You can work for your keep. They can always use help with cooking and cleaning. And Caroline," he waited until she met his eyes, "you don't owe anyone anything. Not your father, not Samuel Garrett, not even me. You understand?" She nodded, though tears were threatening again at the kindness in his voice. He helped her up onto his horse, then mounted behind her. She was acutely aware of his body against her back, his arms around her as he handled the reins. It should have felt improper, should have made her uncomfortable. but instead she felt safer than she had in months. The Callaway Ranch was indeed just 5 miles north, a sprawling collection of buildings that housed the main house, the bunkhouse, and various barns and outbuildings. Cole rode straight to the main house and helped her down before knocking on the door. Martha Callaway answered in her nightgown and wrapper, her gray hair in a long braid over her shoulder. She took one look at Caroline's tear-stained face and Cole's grim expression and ushered them inside without question. "Sit her down by the fire," she ordered, already moving to put a kettle on. "Cole, you want to tell me what's going on?" Cole explained, his voice carefully neutral while Martha made tea and wrapped a blanket around Caroline's shoulders. When he finished, Martha's lips were pressed in a tight line. "Samuel Garrett's a snake," she said flatly. "Always has been. You did right bringing her here, Cole." She turned to Caroline. "You're welcome to stay as long as you need, dear. We'll put you in the spare room upstairs. Can you cook?" "Yes, madam. And clean, so tend a garden, preserve food, care for animals. My mother taught me before she passed." "Then you'll earn your keep helping me around the house. My arthritis has been acting up something fierce, and I could use the help." Martha patted her hand. "Don't you worry about Samuel Garrett. He comes around here making trouble, my husband will run him off with a shotgun." And just like that, Caroline had a place to stay, a refuge, a chance to breathe. Cole visited the next morning before riding out to work the cattle. He found Caroline in the kitchen helping Martha with breakfast, flour on her cheek from making biscuits. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Better." "Scared, but better." She set down her rolling pin. "Cole, I don't know how to thank you. What you did last night, anyone would have done the same." "But they didn't. You did." She met his eyes. "Why?" He was quiet for a moment, his hat in his hands. "Can I ask you something? That day in the mercantile, when you told me you were afraid, that was the bravest thing I'd ever seen. You could have lied, could have protected yourself, but you told me the truth. I guess I wanted to be brave enough to help." Something warm unfurled in Caroline's chest, something that felt dangerously like hope. "Will I see you again?" "Every day," he said, a slight smile tugging at his mouth. "I take my meals here at the main house." After he left, Martha gave Caroline a knowing look. "That boy's sweet on you." "I'm sure he's just being kind. I've known Cole Nash since he started working here 6 months ago. He's kind to everyone, but he doesn't look at everyone the way he looks at you." Caroline felt her cheeks heat. "It doesn't matter. I've caused enough trouble. I won't drag him into more." But over the next weeks, as March turned to April and the prairie began to green, it became harder to maintain that resolve. Cole was there every morning for breakfast and every evening for dinner, and slowly they began to talk. Really talk. She learned he'd been born in Texas, the youngest of 4 boys. His parents had died of fever when he was 16, and he'd been drifting ever since, working ranches across the West, never quite finding a place to settle. He learned she'd grown up in Red Cloud, that she loved to read but rarely had access to books, that her mother had died of consumption, and her father had never quite recovered, drowning his grief in gambling and drink. They talked about everything and nothing. The weather and the cattle. Dreams and disappointments. The shape of clouds and the taste of Martha's apple pie. Each conversation drew them closer, built something between them that felt solid and real. One evening, about 3 weeks after she'd arrived, Cole found her in the barn grooming one of the horses. The sun was setting, painting everything golden. "You're good with animals," he observed, leaning against the stall door. "They're easier than people. They don't lie or make promises they can't keep." "That's pretty cynical for someone so young." She paused in her brushing. "I'm 19. "How old are you?" 24. "So you've got 5 years on me and you're calling me cynical." But she was smiling. He laughed. "Fair point." He was quiet for a moment, then said, "I heard your father came by today looking for you." Her hand stilled. "What did Mr. Calloway tell him?" "That you're staying here of your own free will, and he'd appreciate it if your father didn't come back." Cole paused. "Your father looked rough, Caroline. Real rough." She felt a pang of guilt but pushed it away. "Samuel made good on his threat, didn't he? Father's debts are being called in." "Looks like it. But that's not your fault, isn't it? If I just married Samuel, then you'd be trapped with a man who hits you, and your father would still be a drunk gambler heading for ruin. You can't save someone who won't save himself." She knew he was right, but the guilt still gnawed at her. Her father, for all his faults, had raised her, and now he was losing everything because she'd been too cowardly to go through with a marriage. Cole must have seen something in her face because he came into the stall, took the brush from her hands and set it aside. "Listen to me. What happened to your father isn't your fault. What almost happened to you is your father's fault for selling you to a monster. You don't owe him your life." "Then what do I owe?" she asked, suddenly exhausted. "Everyone wants something from me. My father wanted me to save him from his debts. Samuel wanted me to warm his bed and give him heirs. What do you want, Cole?" He looked at her for a long moment, his eyes serious. "I want you to be happy. I want you to be safe. I want you to have choices. That's all. That's everything." Something broke open in her chest, some last defense she'd been holding on to. She took a step toward him, then another, until they were close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "Caroline," he said, her name both a warning and a prayer. "You asked me once if I wanted to marry Samuel," she said softly. "Can I ask you something now?" He nodded, not trusting his voice. "If I could choose anyone in the world, do you think he might choose me back?" Cole's hand came up to cup her face, his thumb brushing her cheek. "I think any man who had the chance to be chosen by you would count himself the luckiest man alive." "Then let me choose you," she whispered. "Let me promise myself to you instead." He kissed her then, soft and careful, like she was something precious that might break. It was nothing like Samuel's brutal claiming. This was a question, an offering, a promise of gentleness. She kissed him back, her hands fisting in his shirt, trying to convey everything she felt but couldn't yet say. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. "Are you sure? I don't have much, just what I've saved working here. I can't give you a big house or fancy dresses. I don't want those things. I just want to be safe. I want to be with someone kind." "Then you've got me," he said, "for as long as you want me." "How about forever?" His smile was brighter than the setting sun. "Forever sounds about right." They told the Calloways that evening, and Martha cried happy tears while her husband John clapped Cole on the back and declared it the best news he'd heard all year. But the happiness was tempered by practical concerns. "Samuel's not going to like this," John said seriously. "And while I don't think he'll try anything on my land, you two need to be careful when you go into town." "Maybe we shouldn't go into town," Caroline suggested. "Can't hide forever," Cole said. "We've done nothing wrong. We have a right to live our lives." But they decided to wait a few weeks before making any trips to Red Cloud, letting the dust settle. During that time, Caroline felt like she was living in a dream. She woke each morning to help Martha with breakfast, spending the days cooking and cleaning and tending the garden that was just beginning to sprout. And every evening, Cole would find her, and they would walk along the creek or sit on the porch, talking and laughing and stealing kisses when they thought no one was looking. She learned the small things about him: that he took his coffee black and his eggs scrambled, that he had a scar on his left shoulder from a bull that had gored him when he was 20, that he could play the harmonica and sang in a pleasant baritone when he thought no one was listening, that he was unfailingly patient with the younger ranch hands who were still learning, that he was loyal and steady and kind in ways both large and small, and she fell in love with him. Completely, irrevocably in love. One evening in early May, as they sat by the creek watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, she told him so. "I love you," she said simply. "I know it's only been 2 months and maybe that's too fast, but I do. I love you, Cole Nash." He turned to her, his eyes bright. 2 months or 2 years, it wouldn't matter. I've loved you since that day in the general store when you told me which saddle to buy. Maybe even before that, when I caught you from falling and you looked at me like I'd done something remarkable instead of just being decent. You did do something remarkable. You saw me. You saw that I was drowning and you threw me a rope. "Then promise yourself to me," he said, echoing his words from weeks ago. "Not because you have to, not to save anyone or pay anyone's debts, but because you want to." "I already did," she said, smiling. "That night in the barn, but I'll promise again as many times as you want to hear it. I'm yours, Cole, freely given, freely chosen." He kissed her then, deep and thorough, and she felt the promise in it. Safety, partnership, love, all the things she'd thought she'd never have. They decided to get married at the end of May. A small ceremony at the ranch with just the Callaways and a few of the ranch hands as witnesses. Martha made Caroline a dress of blue calico, simple but pretty, and John offered to stand in as her father since Thomas Ellis had made no further attempts to contact her. But a week before the wedding, Caroline went into town with Martha to buy supplies. They'd avoided it as long as possible, but certain things needed to be purchased that couldn't be found at the ranch. Cole had wanted to come, but a fence had broken on the north pasture and he was needed there urgently. "We'll be fine," Martha assured him. "It's broad daylight, and I've got my husband's pistol in my bag. No one's going to bother 2 women doing their shopping." They should have known better. Caroline was examining fabric for curtains when she felt the familiar prickle at the back of her neck that meant she was being watched. She turned to find Samuel standing at the end of the aisle, his expression cold. "Caroline," he said pleasantly, though his eyes were hard as flint. "I heard you've been living at the Callaway Ranch, heard some other interesting things too." "Mr. Garrett," she said, keeping her voice steady. "If you'll excuse me," he moved to block her path. "I also heard you're planning to marry that drifter. Nash, isn't it?" Martha appeared at Caroline's side, her hand in her bag where the pistol rested. "Samuel, we're just here to shop. Let us pass. In a moment." He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I wanted to offer my congratulations and a warning." "We don't want your warnings," Martha said sharply. "Nevertheless, you'll hear it. I've arranged for Caroline's father's debts to be forgiven." He paused, letting that sink in. "All of them. Wiped clean, as a wedding gift." Caroline frowned. "Why would you do that?" "Because I'm not a monster, despite what you might think. And because I want you to know what your choice has cost. Your father could have been saved. You could have had a grand house and everything money could buy. Instead, you've chosen a cowboy who can barely afford to feed himself, let alone a wife." "I'd rather be poor with Cole than rich with you," Caroline said clearly. Something ugly flickered across Samuel's face. "We'll see how long that lasts. Come winter, when you're cold and hungry, when Nash can't find work because I've made sure no ranch within 100 miles will hire him, you'll remember this conversation." "Are you threatening him?" Caroline felt anger rising, hot and bright. "Are you going to ruin another man because your pride is hurt? I'm telling you reality. Nash is nothing, he has nothing, and soon you'll have nothing too." He tipped his hat mockingly. "Enjoy your wedding, Caroline. I hope it's worth it." He left, and Caroline found she was shaking. Martha put an arm around her shoulders. "Don't let him scare you," she said firmly. "He's all bluster. John won't let him drive Cole away, and other ranchers won't play along with his petty revenge. Samuel Garrett's not as powerful as he thinks he is." But Caroline couldn't shake the fear that had settled in her stomach. What if Samuel found a way to hurt Cole? What if her choice to save herself ended up destroying the man she loved? When they returned to the ranch and told Cole and John what had happened, Cole's jaw tightened but his voice remained calm. "He's trying to scare you, that's all. Don't let him." "But what if he does what he threatened? What if he gets you blacklisted? Then we'll go somewhere else." Montana, Wyoming, California. There's always work for a man who knows cattle and isn't afraid of hard work. He took her hands. "Caroline, look at me. I'm not afraid of Samuel Garrett. The only thing I'm afraid of is losing you." "So unless he scared you off, unless you're having second thoughts, no," she said quickly. "Never. I just don't want you to suffer because of me. Being with you isn't suffering. It's the opposite of suffering. It's the first time in years I've felt like I have a home, a future, something to build toward. I'm not giving that up because of threats from a bitter man." John cleared his throat. "Besides, I've got some friends who'd like to hear about Samuel's threats, friends who don't much care for bullies. Word gets around that he's trying to blacklist good workers out of spite. He'll find himself the pariah, not us." So they went ahead with the wedding as planned. On a beautiful May morning, with wildflowers blooming across the prairie and the sky so blue it hurt to look at, Caroline Ellis became Caroline Nash. The ceremony was simple, performed by a circuit preacher who happened to be passing through. Caroline wore her blue calico dress and carried a bouquet of wildflowers Cole had picked at dawn. Cole wore his best shirt and a new string tie Martha had bought him as a wedding gift. They stood on the porch of the main house, surrounded by the people who had become their family, and spoke vows that were both traditional and deeply personal. "I promise to love you, protect you, and stand beside you," Cole said, his voice steady but his eyes bright with emotion. "I promise to give you choices always. I promise to be worthy of the gift of your trust." Caroline's voice shook but didn't break. "I promise to love you, support you, and build a life with you. I promise to choose you every day, not because I have to, but because I want to. I promise to be your partner in all things." They exchanged simple gold bands that had belonged to Martha's parents, and when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Cole kissed her like she was the answer to every prayer he'd never known to pray. The celebration afterward was joyful and relaxed. Martha had made a feast, and John produced a bottle of good whiskey he'd been saving for a special occasion. The ranch hands played music on fiddle and harmonica, and they danced on the porch as the sun set and the stars came out. Later, Cole led Caroline to the small cabin on the edge of the property that John had offered them as their home. It was just 2 rooms, a main room with a stove and table and a bedroom barely big enough for a bed and wardrobe, but to Caroline it looked like a palace. "It's not much," Cole said, suddenly nervous. "It's perfect," she said honestly. "It's ours." That night he loved her with the same gentleness he'd shown from the beginning, turning what she'd feared would be painful and degrading into something beautiful and connecting. Afterward, lying in his arms, she felt truly safe for the first time in months. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. "I love you too," he said, his arm tightening around her. "My wife," she smiled. "My husband." The summer passed in a haze of happiness. Caroline settled into life on the ranch, helping Martha during the days and coming home to Cole in the evenings. They were poor by any measure, their cabin sparsely furnished, their clothes mended and remended, but Caroline had never been happier. Cole was everything Samuel wasn't. He was gentle and considerate. He asked her opinion on decisions. He helped with household chores without being asked. He made her laugh. He held her when she cried about her father, who had left Red Cloud in disgrace and whose whereabouts were unknown. He was her partner in every sense of the word. And true to John's word, Samuel's threats came to nothing. A few ranchers had apparently approached Cole about leaving, but when John made it clear he was backing his hired hand, and when word spread about why Cole had gotten crosswise with Garrett in the first place, public opinion shifted. Turned out a lot of people had suspected the truth about Samuel's first two wives, but had been too afraid to speak up. Caroline's flight had opened a door for others to share their stories about Samuel's temper and his treatment of women. By late summer, Samuel's reputation was in tatters. Several women he'd courted turned him down publicly. The banker started asking harder questions about his accounts, and when a young woman from his ranch came forward claiming he'd assaulted her, the town marshal finally started an investigation. It all came to a head in September. The marshal arrested Samuel on charges of assault and murder, the latter based on new evidence about his second wife's death. Turned out the horse that had supposedly killed her had been sold shortly after her death to a rancher in Iowa, and that rancher reported the animal was gentle as a lamb. The case would take months to work through the courts, but Samuel Garrett would be spending them in jail. When Cole brought the news home, Caroline felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. "Is it really over?" she asked. "It's really over," he confirmed. "He can't hurt you anymore." She burst into tears, and he held her through them, understanding that these were tears of relief, of release, of finally being able to believe in her own safety. That night, they made love with a joy and freedom that had been missing before. The last shadow of Samuel's threat finally lifted. And later, curled against Cole's side, Caroline thought about how close she'd come to a completely different life. How if she hadn't run that night, if Cole hadn't stopped to help her, she would be trapped or dead by now. "What are you thinking about?" Cole asked, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her shoulder. "About fate," she said. "About how many things had to happen exactly right for us to end up here. I think about that too sometimes. What if I hadn't stopped in Red Cloud? What if I'd gone to Montana instead like I'd been planning? What if I hadn't been at the store that day? Maybe we would have found each other anyway. Maybe some things are meant to be." He kissed the top of her head. "I like that idea. That you were meant to be mine and I was meant to be yours." Fall turned to winter, and Caroline discovered she was pregnant. The news filled them both with joy and terror in equal measure. They were so young, with so little money, living in a cabin that would be cramped with a baby, but Martha laughed at their concerns. "People have been raising babies with less for thousands of years. You'll figure it out. You've got family to help you." And they did have family. The Callaways and the ranch hands all rallied around them, offering hand-me-down baby clothes and a cradle John built in his workshop. The other ranch wives gave advice and supplies. By the time their son was born in late April of 1879, they had everything they needed. They named him Thomas, after Caroline's father, a gesture of forgiveness for the man who had sold her, but who had also raised her in his way. Cole held his son with wonder in his eyes, marveling at the tiny fingers and toes, the shock of dark hair, the eyes that would eventually turn the same creek water color as his own. "He's perfect," Cole whispered. "We made him," Caroline said, still awed by the fact. "We made a whole person." Raising Thomas was harder than anything Caroline had ever done, but also more rewarding. The sleepless nights were made bearable by Cole getting up with her, walking the floor with their crying son so Caroline could rest. The endless laundry and cooking and cleaning were made easier by the fact that they were doing it together, building a life. Thomas was 6 months old when they received word that Samuel Garrett had been convicted of murder and sentenced to hang. Caroline felt no joy at the news, just a deep sense of finality. That chapter of her life was truly closed now. Cole found her that evening sitting on the porch, watching the sunset with Thomas asleep in her arms. "You all right?" he asked, settling beside her. "I was just thinking about those women, Samuel's wives, how they didn't get to escape like I did." She looked at her husband. "I'm alive because of you. I'm happy because of you. Thomas exists because of you. How do I ever repay that?" "You already have," Cole said simply. "You chose me. Every day you keep choosing me. That's more than I ever thought I'd have." "I'll choose you every day for the rest of my life," she promised. "I'll choose you when we're old and gray. I'll choose you when things are hard. I'll choose you always." He kissed her softly. "And I'll choose you. That's the promise we made. That's the promise we'll keep." The years passed gently. Thomas grew into a bright, energetic boy who loved horses and had his father's steady temperament. When he was 3, Caroline gave birth to a daughter they named Martha, after the woman who had given them sanctuary. 2 years later came another son, John, named for his godfather. Cole worked his way up from hired hand to foreman at the Callaway Ranch, and when John Callaway passed away in 1885, he left Cole a portion of the ranch in his will. Not enough to make them rich, but enough to give them security, to ensure their children's futures. Caroline became known as one of the finest cooks in the county, and she took in sewing to bring in extra money. Their cabin expanded over the years, adding rooms as the family grew, until it was a proper house with glass windows and a real wood floor and a parlor for entertaining. They had their struggles, of course: harsh winters and dry summers, cattle diseases and market fluctuations, the children's various illnesses and injuries that had Caroline pacing the floor in worry until they recovered, the normal difficulties of any life. But through it all, they had each other. Cole never raised his hand to her in anger, never spoke to her with cruelty or contempt. Caroline never regretted her choice to run, to choose herself, to choose him. They built a partnership based on respect and love, and the deep knowledge that they had saved each other. On their 20th wedding anniversary in 1899, their children threw them a party. Thomas was 19 and courting a rancher's daughter. Martha was 17 and had just been accepted to the teaching college in Lincoln. John was 15 and already showing his father's skill with horses and cattle. As the celebration wound down and the children cleaned up, Cole led Caroline out to the porch where they'd been married 2 decades earlier. The prairie stretched out before them, silver in the moonlight. "Do you remember standing here that day?" he asked. "You in your blue dress with wildflowers in your hair." "I remember thinking I'd never been so sure of anything in my life," Caroline said. "I remember looking at you and thinking that as long as I had you, everything would be all right." Was I right? Is everything all right? She looked at him, this man who had stopped to catch her when she stumbled, who had seen her fear and offered her freedom, who had loved her gently and completely for 20 years. His hair was starting to gray at the temples now, and there were lines around his eyes from years of squinting into the sun, but to her, he was as handsome as the day she'd met him. "Everything is more than all right," she said. "Everything is perfect. We built this, Cole. This life, this family, this love. We built it together." "You built it," he corrected gently. "You're the one who was brave enough to run. You're the one who chose freedom. I just got lucky enough to be there when you did." "Then promise yourself to me," she said, repeating his words from that night in the barn all those years ago. "Promise you'll be there for the next 20 years and the 20 after that." "I promise," he said. "For as long as we both shall live, I'm yours, freely given, freely chosen." "Freely given, freely chosen," she echoed, and kissed him there on the porch where they'd pledged their lives to each other, where they'd danced at their wedding, where they'd watched their children grow, where they'd built a life from nothing but love and determination. The years continued to roll by with the gentle persistence of the creek that ran through the Callaway Ranch. Thomas married his rancher's daughter in 1901 and gave Cole and Caroline their first grandchild, a girl they named Caroline in honor of her grandmother. Martha became a teacher in Red Cloud, educating a generation of children and never marrying, claiming she was wedded to her work. John took over the management of the ranch when Cole's joints began to ache too much for the long hours in the saddle. Cole and Caroline settled into a peaceful old age. They kept chickens and a garden, sold eggs and vegetables in town. Caroline taught her granddaughters to sew and cook and preserve food, passing on the skills her own mother had taught her. Cole taught his grandsons about horses and cattle and the value of honest work. They were known in Red Cloud as a love story, the kind people pointed to when they wanted to believe in happy endings. Young women facing unwanted marriages would sometimes come to Caroline for advice, and she would tell them what Cole had once told her, that there's always a choice, that they should never let fear make their decisions for them. On quiet evenings, they would sit on their porch and watch the sunset paint the prairie in shades of gold and rose. Sometimes they would talk about the old days, marveling at how far they'd come from that frightened girl and protective cowboy. Sometimes they would sit in comfortable silence, their hands clasped, no words needed after so many years together. In the spring of 1918, Caroline fell ill with the influenza that was sweeping the country. She was 60 years old and had lived a full, rich life, but Cole wasn't ready to let her go. He nursed her with the same gentle care he'd shown her from the beginning, sitting by her bedside day and night. When it became clear she wouldn't recover, he climbed into bed beside her, holding her like he'd held her on their wedding night and every night since. "I'm not afraid," she whispered, her voice weak but steady. "I've had such a good life, Cole, so much love, no regrets." "Stay with me a little longer," he said, tears running down his weathered cheeks. "I'm not ready. You'll be fine. You've got the children and grandchildren. They'll take care of you." She touched his face with a trembling hand. "Thank you for saving me. Thank you for loving me. Thank you for the life we built together. Thank you for choosing me," he said. "Thank you for running that night. Thank you for being brave enough to save yourself." "Then promise yourself to me," she said, smiling at the words that had become their private refrain over the decades. "Promise you'll remember me. Promise you'll remember what we had. Every day," he vowed. "I'll remember every single day." She died peacefully in his arms, her last breath a gentle sigh, her face relaxed and content. Cole held her for a long time after, not quite able to let go of the woman who had been his whole world for nearly 40 years. He lived another 5 years without her. Years filled with grandchildren and great-grandchildren, with the ranch work he still supervised despite his age, with the memories of a love that had defined his life. He spoke of her often, sharing stories with anyone who would listen about the brave girl who had chosen freedom, the woman who had built a life with him from nothing but determination and love. When he died in his sleep in 1923, at the age of 69, his children found him with a smile on his face and his hand outstretched across the bed, as if reaching for Caroline in his dreams. They buried him beside her in the Red Cloud Cemetery, under a simple stone that read, "Cole and Caroline Nash, freely given, freely chosen." Their story passed into local legend, told and retold by their descendants and the people of Red Cloud. The cabin where they'd lived became the main house of what was now the Nash Ranch, run by John's son and then his grandson. The porch where they'd married became a popular spot for marriage proposals, young men bringing their sweethearts there to pledge their love. And every spring, when the wildflowers bloomed across the Nebraska prairie, Someone would place a bouquet on their grave, remembering the love story that had started with fear and a midnight flight and ended with a lifetime of happiness. Remembering that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is choose yourself, and that sometimes when you choose yourself, you find someone who will choose you right back. Their great-great-granddaughter, preparing for her own wedding in 1965, asked her grandmother what she should know about love. The old woman, Martha's daughter, smiled and shared the words that had been passed down through 5 generations of Nash women. When someone promises to love you, make sure they also promise to give you choices. Make sure they see you as a person, not a possession. And if you're ever afraid, remember your great-great-grandmother Caroline, who was brave enough to run into the dark, brave enough to ask for help, brave enough to choose love over fear. That's the legacy she left us. That's what real love looks like. And so the story lived on, a testament to courage and kindness, to the power of choosing yourself and the magic of being chosen in return. In a time and place where women had few rights and fewer options, Caroline Ellis had taken her fate into her own hands and run toward freedom. And Cole Nash had stood in her defense, offering protection without possession, help without obligation, love without conditions. Their love story wasn't perfect because perfect doesn't exist, but it was real and true and strong enough to weather everything life threw at it. It was built on a foundation of mutual respect and genuine affection. It grew from a moment of crisis into a lifetime of partnership. And it proved that even in the wildest parts of the West, in the hardest of times, love could not just survive but thrive. Years later, long after anyone who had known them personally was gone, a writer came to Red Cloud researching stories of the Old West. She stumbled upon the tale of Caroline and Cole, preserved in letters and diaries and oral histories passed down through generations. She spent months piecing together their story, tracking down descendants, reading Cole's brief but heartfelt journal entries and Caroline's detailed letters to Martha. What emerged was a portrait of 2 people who had found each other at exactly the right moment. Caroline, desperate and trapped with just enough strength left to save herself. Cole, drifting and rootless, looking for something worth staying for. Their meeting had changed both their lives irrevocably, giving Caroline the family and security she'd always wanted, giving Cole a home and purpose he'd never known he needed. The writer published their story, and it touched hearts across the country. Women wrote to say it had given them courage to leave bad situations. Men wrote to say it had taught them what real strength looked like. Young people wrote to say it had shown them what kind of love to look for and what kind to run from. Because at its heart, the story of Caroline and Cole Nash was simple and profound. She was promised to a man she feared. The cowboy said, "Then promise yourself to me." And in choosing each other, in promising themselves to each other freely and without coercion, they had built something beautiful that lasted not just a lifetime but for generations. Their cabin still stands on the Nash Ranch, preserved now as a historical landmark. Visitors can walk through the rooms where they lived and loved, see the table where they shared meals, the fireplace where they warmed themselves on cold winter nights, the porch where they danced at their wedding and watched their grandchildren play. Photos line the walls, showing their faces aging together, always side by side. Cole's hand on Caroline's shoulder, Caroline's head resting on Cole's chest, the visible evidence of a love that only grew stronger with time. In the bedroom, displayed in a glass case, is Caroline's blue calico wedding dress and the wildflowers Cole picked for her that morning, preserved somehow against the ravages of time. And on the wall above the bed where they spent nearly 40 years together is a framed piece of needlework made by Caroline in her later years, stitched in careful letters. Then promise yourself to me. Freely given, freely chosen. These words, spoken on a spring night in 1878 in a barn lit by lamplight, became the foundation of a love that proved stronger than fear, more lasting than wealth, more precious than anything either of them could have imagined when they started. They became a promise that Cole and Caroline kept to each other every day of their married life, a promise that echoed through generations, inspiring others to choose courage over fear, love over obligation, freedom over security bought at too high a price. And on quiet Nebraska evenings, when the wind whispers across the prairie and the setting sun paints the sky in brilliant colors, some say you can still feel them there. Caroline in her kitchen, humming as she works. Cole on the porch, watching for her smile. Two souls who found each other in the darkness and built a light strong enough to guide others home. Their story reminds us that love, real love, isn't about grand gestures or perfect circumstances. It's about choosing each other every day. It's about seeing someone's fear and offering them safety. It's about being brave enough to ask for help and generous enough to give it. It's about building a life together one day at a time, through hardship and joy, through struggle and celebration, through all the ordinary moments that add up to an extraordinary lifetime. Cole and Caroline Nash didn't set out to be a legend. They just set out to be happy, to be safe, to be free to love each other without fear or reservation. And in doing so, in making that simple choice to promise themselves to each other, they created something that lasted far beyond their own lives. They created a legacy of love that continues to inspire and encourage, proving that even in the hardest times, even when the odds seem impossible, choosing love and choosing yourself can lead to happiness beyond measure. The end.